You know that scene. Denzel Washington walks out of a diner on a crowded Harlem sidewalk, pulls a pistol, presses it against a man's forehead, and fires. The man drops. Denzel takes the cash from the body. He walks back to his family, sits down, picks up his fork, and keeps eating breakfast. His brothers stare in stunned silence. He does not blink. He does not flinch. He just took a life in front of 50 witnesses in broad daylight on a busy street and went back to his eggs like nothing happened. That scene made American Gangster iconic. It made Denzel's portrayal of Frank Lucas legendary. It made the character Tango, played by Idris Elba, into one of the most memorable on-screen deaths in crime movie history. And it's based on a lie. Frank Lucas didn't kill Tango. And the deeper you dig into this story, the more you realize that the Tango murder isn't just one lie. It's the lie that started all the others. The first brick in a mythology that Frank Lucas spent 40 years constructing. It led to a Hollywood movie worth $266 million, a technical consulting fee of $300,000, a home purchased for him by Denzel Washington and Ridley Scott worth $500,000, and a legacy as one of the most feared men in American criminal history. Except almost none of it was real. And this is how we know. In the winter of 2000, a magazine writer named Mark Jacobson knocked on the door of a government-subsidized apartment across from Newark's City Hall. The man who opened the door was Frank Lucas. He was nearly 70 years old. He was broke, and he did not have much furniture. He had one car, a beat-up 1980s Cadillac with a leaking transmission he could not afford to fix. But Frank Lucas had something more valuable than money. He had his story, and he was ready to tell it. Jacobson was writing a piece for New York Magazine. The article would be called The Return of Superfly. In that article, Frank Lucas would describe in vivid detail how he killed a man named Tango on a crowded Harlem street in front of the New Canaan Baptist Church on 116th Street. According to Frank, Tango was a terrifying figure. 6'5", 270 pounds, bald head, wore those Italian-style undershirts. Lucas described him as a silverback gorilla. He said the man had killed 2 or 3 people with his bare hands. Everyone on the street was afraid of him. And Frank said he chose Tango specifically because of that fear. The way Frank told the story, he confronted Tango about money owed. Tango cursed at him, Tango charged at him, and Frank pulled out his pistol and shot him 4 times in the head, right there in the middle of the afternoon on a busy sidewalk. Frank described the aftermath with chilling casualness. He said the back of Tango's skull was gone, that it was his initiation fee for taking over Harlem's drug trade. He boasted that he had killed the most dangerous man, not just in Harlem, but in the entire world. This was the story that got Mark Jacobson his article. This was the story that caught the attention of Hollywood producers Brian Grazer and Ridley Scott. This was the story that became the spine of a $93 million movie starring Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe. But even the movie couldn't resist making the lie bigger. In Frank's original telling to Jacobson, his brothers weren't there. He didn't walk back to a diner to finish breakfast within eyeshot of a corpse. There was no family watching from across the street. Those details were invented by screenwriter Steven Zaillian, the man behind Schindler's List, to make the scene more cinematic. So what you watched in the theater wasn't just a dramatization of a real event. It was a dramatization of a lie with additional fabrications layered on top. Hollywood didn't just adapt Frank's story, it improved upon his fiction. And Idris Elba, one of the most talented actors of his generation, played a character whose real-life murder may never have happened at all. There was just one problem. Frank Lucas was never charged with murder, not for Tango, not for anyone. There is no police report, there is no arrest record, there is no coroner's file, there are no witness statements, no criminal charges were ever filed in connection with Tango's death. And years later, Frank Lucas himself would deny the entire thing. The man who built his legend on the murder of Tango took it back. Here's where it gets interesting. After The Return of Superfly was published in 2000 and became the basis for the movie, Frank Lucas began slowly, carefully walking back the Tango story. In later interviews, on Vlad TV, in conversations with reporters, in passing comments, Frank denied committing the murder. He was never pressed hard on it, because by then, the movie had already been made. $266 million had already been earned. The legend had already been cemented in the public consciousness. But think about what this means. Frank Lucas told a journalist that he murdered a man in broad daylight. That story was published in one of the most prestigious magazines in America. That story became the opening act of a major Hollywood film. Denzel Washington performed the killing on screen. Idris Elba played the victim. Ridley Scott directed it. The scene was marketed as being based on real events. And then Frank said it didn't happen. This wasn't a small detail. This wasn't a minor embellishment about what kind of car he drove or how much money he made on a given Tuesday. This was a murder. This was the foundational act of violence that established Frank Lucas as a man willing to do anything to claim power. This was the moment that supposedly launched his empire, and he made it up. Mark Jacobson, the journalist who wrote the original article, later admitted that the story's potential sketchiness was always there. He acknowledged that he frequently used phrases such as Frank claims and according to Lucas throughout the piece. He admitted he was not an investigative journalist and did not verify Frank's claims. Jacobson essentially said he served as a stenographer. He wrote down what Frank said and published it. But Jacobson went further than that. Years later, reflecting on his relationship with Frank after Lucas's death in 2019, Jacobson wrote that Frank had been waiting for someone exactly like him to come knocking on his door. He said Frank needed a writer to put his story out there the way he had once needed a fearsome street enforcer to clear his path. Jacobson admitted he was mesmerized by the tales: ninjas in the jungle, heroin on Henry Kissinger's plane, coffins full of dope flown home from Vietnam. The stories grew more outrageous as the interview went on, and Jacobson kept writing them down. Ron Chapiziak, who investigated Frank's claims for years, was blunt about Jacobson's role. He said Jacobson played stenographer to Frank's fantasies. He said that if Jacobson had checked the facts, the article would have collapsed and the movie would never have been made. But Jacobson was a magazine writer on deadline, not an investigative reporter. He was intimidated by Frank, who could be a bully in interviews. And he was seduced by a story that was, as Jacobson admitted, too good to fact-check. The question nobody asked at the time, the question that matters now, is this: if Frank lied about murdering Tango, what else did he lie about? The answer, as it turns out, is almost everything. The Tango story is not an isolated fabrication. It is one chapter in a decades-long campaign of self-mythologizing that Frank Lucas conducted with remarkable consistency and remarkable audacity. Start with his relationship to Bumpy Johnson and the man whose life Frank Lucas actually stole. In the movie, Frank is Bumpy's right-hand man for 15 years, his driver, his confidant, the man who was with Bumpy when he died, the heir to his criminal empire. In reality, Bumpy Johnson's widow, Mamie Johnson, publicly and repeatedly called Frank Lucas a liar. She said Frank was never part of Bumpy's inner circle. She said Bumpy never had anyone drive him for 15 years. She said the most Bumpy might have done for Frank was let him carry his coat occasionally. She was emphatic that Frank was not present when Bumpy died. Bumpy collapsed at Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue in 1968, and he died in the arms of his childhood friend, Junie Bird, not Frank Lucas. Karen Quinones, in her book Harlem Godfather, pointed out that Bumpy was released from prison in 1963 and died in 1968. That is a 5-year window. Frank could not have been his driver for 15 years because Bumpy had not been free for 15 years. But here is the part nobody talks about, the part that changes everything. According to Mamie Johnson, the story Frank Lucas told the world, the close relationship with Bumpy, the role as his trusted driver, the man who learned the game at the master's feet, did not belong to Frank Lucas at all. It belonged to a man named Zach Walker. Zach Flash Walker was a young Harlem hustler who actually lived with Bumpy Johnson and his family. He was the one who was truly close to Bumpy. He was the one who drove for Bumpy. He was the one who was part of Bumpy's inner circle. He was the real right hand. According to Mamie Johnson, Frank Lucas simply took Zach Walker's life story and claimed it as his own. And this is where the Tango murder comes full circle. According to Mamie Johnson's account, it was not Frank Lucas who killed Tango. It was Zach Walker. Walker was the man who had the confrontation with the tall, feared Harlem gangster over a dispute. Walker was the man who pulled the trigger. Walker was the one whose act of violence on the streets of Harlem became the stuff of legend. Frank Lucas heard the story. Years later, sitting in an empty Newark apartment with Mark Jacobson, he told it as if it were his own. Think about what this means. The most iconic scene in American Gangster, the moment that defined Frank Lucas as a ruthless power player, the moment Denzel Washington immortalized on screen, the moment that launched a $266 million movie, was not just a lie. It was a stolen lie. Frank Lucas did not just fabricate the Tango murder, he took another man's act of violence, another man's reputation, another man's relationship with Bumpy Johnson, and he wore it like a mask. Zach Walker lived with Bumpy's family. Frank Lucas carried Bumpy's coat. One of these men was the right hand. The other told the world he was. Hollywood believed the wrong one. Then there is the coffin story. The central mythology of American Gangster was that Frank Lucas smuggled heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers returning from Vietnam. That claim became the most famous part of his story, and it is what made him legendary. According to Leslie Ike Atkinson, the man who actually ran the Southeast Asian smuggling operation, it is a complete fabrication. Atkinson was a retired U.S. Army sergeant married to one of Frank's cousins. He was the real connection to the Golden Triangle, and he flatly denied the coffin story. He said he smuggled heroin inside hollowed-out furniture, not coffins. He called Frank's version a total lie fueled by personal gain. Investigative journalist Ron Chapisiuk, who spent years researching Frank Lucas for his book Superfly, The True Untold Story of Frank Lucas, American Gangster, confirmed that he found no evidence or court records to support the coffin claim. He called it the biggest hoax in the history of the international drug trade. Even the federal judge who prosecuted Frank Sterling Johnson Jr. eventually acknowledged the myth. He said the movie was 1% reality and 99% Hollywood. He described the real Frank Lucas as illiterate, vicious, violent, and everything Denzel Washington was not. Frank claimed he made $1 million a day. That was later discovered to be an exaggeration. Frank claimed he exposed corrupt DEA agents. 3 former DEA agents sued Universal Pictures over that claim. Agent Jack Toll, who used Frank as an informant for years, said Frank never once mentioned a corrupt DEA agent or cop. A DEA spokesman confirmed that no agents were ever charged with wrongdoing in connection with Frank's cooperation. The judge in the lawsuit called the movie's claim wholly inaccurate. Frank claimed his cousin was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan when Frank was 6 years old, and that this event set him on the path of crime. Ron Chapesiuk found no evidence this ever happened. The pattern is clear. Frank Lucas was not just a drug dealer who embellished a few stories. He was a professional myth maker who constructed an entire fictional persona and sold it to a magazine, to Hollywood, and to the world. And it all started with the lie about Tango. To understand why Frank Lucas fabricated the Tango murder and so much else, you have to understand where he was in life when Mark Jacobson knocked on his door in 2000. Frank Lucas was broke. Not just regular broke, he was fallen empire broke. The government had seized everything when he was arrested in 1975. Properties in Chicago, Detroit, Miami, North Carolina, Puerto Rico, all of it gone. His offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were emptied. His 70-year prison sentence was reduced to 5 years because he became an informant. He cooperated extensively. Frank even gave up his own mother. After his release, Frank was arrested again in 1984 for drug dealing, this time small scale. He served another 7 years. He got out in 1991. By 2000, he was living in a government-subsidized apartment in Newark with no money, no furniture, one broken-down Cadillac, and nothing left except his story. And here is the cruel irony Frank could never escape. The man who portrayed himself as the most feared gangster in Harlem, the man who bragged about executing Tango in broad daylight, the man whose movie ends with a title card claiming he helped bring down 3/4 of the DEA, that man was one of the most prolific snitches in federal history. His 70-year sentence was cut to 5 years. He gave up over 100 drug dealers, his own associates, his own network. Federal Judge Sterling Johnson said he did not know anyone who had made more cases. And yet, when confronted about it in interviews, Frank would lose his temper and deny it. He told Mark Jacobson he had never testified on anybody in his life. When pressed, he got visibly angry. But the court records are clear. The newspaper records are clear. A 1984 New York Times headline identified him as a heroin informant convicted by a U.S. jury. So Frank was a man who snitched on 100 people and denied it, who claimed a murder he did not commit and then denied that too, who stole another man's life story and presented it as his own. Every version of Frank Lucas was a performance. And the greatest performance of all was the one he gave to Mark Jacobson in that empty Newark apartment. His story was his last asset. And Frank knew that a story about a drug dealer who sold heroin was not enough to get a movie deal. Harlem had dozens of those guys. What Frank needed was mythology. He needed to be larger than life. He needed to be the man who killed the most dangerous person in Harlem with his bare hands and walked back to breakfast. He needed to be the man who smuggled heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers. He needed to be the man who brought down 3/4 of the DEA. So that is what he became. In that empty Newark apartment, talking to a magazine writer who admitted he was not an investigative journalist, Frank Lucas simply invented himself. And it worked. The New York Magazine article led to the movie deal. The movie led to a $300,000 consulting fee. It led to Denzel Washington and Ridley Scott buying him a $500,000 home. It led to documentaries on the History Channel and BET, both of which paid him. It led to a book deal, his autobiography, Original Gangster. The total financial windfall from Frank's mythology was likely well over $1 million. Not bad for a man who, according to the people who actually knew him, was a mid-level Harlem operator who exaggerated his way into criminal immortality. Ron Chapiziuk put it best when he explained Frank's predicament. When Frank first told these stories to Mark Jacobson, he never imagined a movie would result from it. He was just bragging to a journalist in an empty apartment, the way old gangsters do. But the article exploded. Hollywood came calling, and suddenly Frank was trapped by his own lies. He could not walk them back without destroying the deal. So he doubled down, and doubled down again, and doubled down until the lies became the official history. As Chapiziuk said, like Pinocchio, the more Frank talked, the longer the tale got. So who was the real Frank Lucas? He was a real drug dealer. That part is true. He did operate out of Harlem in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He did sell heroin. He did recruit his brothers from North Carolina, the Country Boys, to run his operation. He did make significant money, though nothing close to the $1 million a day he claimed. He was arrested in 1975, and his cooperation with authorities did lead to convictions of other drug dealers. But he was not Bumpy Johnson's right-hand man. He was not the strategic genius the movie portrays. He was not the man who opened the Asian connection. That was Ike Atkinson. He did not smuggle heroin in coffins. He did not bring down corrupt DEA agents. He was not charged with or convicted of any murder. And the defining act of violence that established his legend, the killing of Tango on a crowded Harlem street, was a story he told to a journalist, had turned into a movie scene and then denied. Judge Sterling Johnson, who as special narcotics prosecutor put Frank Lucas away, said the man was illiterate, vicious, and violent. Not the suave, calculating mastermind that Denzel Washington brought to life. The real Frank Lucas was a dangerous man, but he was dangerous in the ordinary, brutal way that drug dealers in the 1970s Harlem were dangerous, not in the legendary, cinematic way the movie suggests. And that's the point. American Gangster grossed over $266 million worldwide. It was nominated for 2 Academy Awards. It launched an entire mythology that has been repeated as fact in documentaries, articles, YouTube videos, podcasts, and conversations for nearly 2 decades. And the foundation of all of it, the murder of Tango, the scene that opens the film and establishes Frank Lucas as a figure of terrifying power, was made up by a broke old man in a Newark apartment who needed a good story to sell. Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019. He was 88 years old. He died having successfully sold the world a version of himself that was, in the words of the judge who prosecuted him, 1% reality and 99% Hollywood. The Tango murder never happened. And once you accept that, you have to reconsider everything else. Because if the first brick was a lie, the whole building is suspect. And that's the real truth about American Gangster.